delighted to say that the former congressman, former U.S. ambassador to the UN, and former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young, joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
We're very, very honored to have you here. Your life is so comprehensively interesting and accomplished that one hardly knows where to start. So let's begin at a point where your racial consciousness
Can I
began to
just
grow.
say right
Sure.
why I'm here now in Nigeria?
Well, I was going to ask you that a bit later on, but if
Okay.
you want to talk about it first,
Yeah,
you can.
I'd like to start with that
Sure.
because I've been in government, I've been in civil rights. I'm older now, but we still have a lot of work to do. But I found that in civil society, which is neither government nor business, but a few dedicated individuals can come together and make a big difference. And I'm here with Sir Emeka Ofor, who has come together with Rotary International and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we're working on wiping out the last vestiges of polio from the country of Nigeria. Now, this is a long struggle for me because I started dealing with polio as a child when Franklin Roosevelt, our president, had polio. But to be able to wipe this disease off the face of the earth is something that's taken a lot of time, but governments couldn't do it, and no individual could do it. But the role of civil society, particularly Rotary International, the role of our churches. Churches are a part of civil society, a highest part, I hope. But you don't have to be in government. You don't have to have millions of dollars to make a difference. Martin Luther King never had any money. He was never rich. And he had a very good education, and he dedicated his life to the service of others. And I think that's something that we have to focus on. And we've normally focused on government as though what government says and does is true, but there's almost no government that has a clear majority anymore. That governments are 40, 50%, one, 53%, 49%, you know, and the world is more complex than it has ever been, I think, in the history of humankind.
I think that's a very good opening, and I would like to talk to you more about Nigeria and about Africa and the work that you've done on the continent over the past years and that you're still doing today. But just going back to the outset, the original sort of question I was asking you, you grew up in very privileged circumstances. I mean, compared to a lot of people in America, I mean, compared to a lot of other black folks there, you lived in big cities, and to some extent you were protected from racism and segregation. I'm trying to understand how you evolved into becoming a civil rights activist.
As I said, growing up in a neighborhood that was 90% white, and my brother and I were the only black children in that neighborhood. Now, there were other black people in the neighborhood. But then I had to go to a segregated school in another neighborhood on the other side of town, where I had a different kind of problem. But both were very, very important to me because one taught me how to deal with race, the other taught me how to deal with poverty. And I've been struggling to abolish poverty and racism. And ironically, the neighborhood I lived in, the white citizens were the poorest. It's just everything for me has been sort of backwards. But Martin Luther King grew up in a privileged home, and his father, his grandfather, was the president, was the treasurer of the National Baptist Convention when it had 6 million members, and he managed all the money. But he didn't let Martin he didn't guarantee Martin anything but an education.
And of course, your father was a dentist.
My father was a dentist, and his father managed money for burial societies. There was quite a social structure that came to the United States from Africa within slavery, and we don't know much about it. We always see the horrors of slavery, and they were horrible. But at the same time, the African slaves came from sophisticated cultures. They had customs, they had languages, they knew how to hunt, they knew how to plant. They had their own forms of healing and medicine. They were not primitive peoples at all. And they adapted very well to the New World. In fact, one of the reasons we've been set upon so much is that, and one of the reasons why it's difficult now, is that black people are doing very, very well. You turn on a football game, it looks like Nigerians have taken over American football. And the same in basketball. And the arts and music. I mean, American jazz and American blues is as African as you can get.
But is that because those were the areas that white America allowed black America to participate in? I mean,
no, those were the areas where we were comfortable.
Right.
We were not allowed to do anything. We had to fight to do everything.
Right.
We had to fight to form our own churches, and we've tended to think that it was white Christians who converted slaves to Christianity. But more recently, there's history that shows that the Orthodox Church out of Ethiopia had come down into Uganda and into the Congo, and that the slaves that came out of the Congo basin brought Christianity with them. The Christianity that came directly from the Ethiopian who helped Jesus bear the cross. We know so little about our history, and we're not taught our history. But one of the things that we've done in colleges like Howard University, where I went to school, and Morehouse College, where Martin Luther King went to school, is we have explored the African origins of civilization, and we're learning more and more. In fact, the U.S. ambassador to Nigeria told me last night about the Nok culture,
yes,
which was just north of here in Abuja.
Absolutely.
And I'd never heard of that before.
Yeah.
But
it's a very old
they
culture.
had a 3,500 years old before Christ.
Yes.
With a very well-developed civilization in iron and metal workings that were not even yet discovered in Europe.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you to just hold the discussion for a minute. We're going to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Andrew Young. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu, a former leader in the civil rights movement and close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Andrew Young built a career in local and global politics as the US ambassador to the United Nations, a member of the House of Representatives, and the mayor of Atlanta. In 1972, Young was elected to Congress, becoming the first African-American representative from the Deep South since Reconstruction. He sponsored legislation that established a U.S. Institute for Peace, the African Development Bank, etc. But before that, he'd been a pastor in southern Georgia, which is how he became active in the civil rights movement, organizing voter registration drives in 1954 in the face of death threats. After a few years with the National Council of Churches in New York, he returned to Georgia in 1961 to lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's citizenship schools, working closely with Dr. King to teach non-violent organizing strategies. Here he is talking about those civil rights years and how he eventually got into politics.
I followed with Dr. King from Albany to Birmingham to Savannah, St. Augustine, Selma, New York, Watts, Los Angeles. When Dr. King got killed, the night before he went to Memphis, he had a meeting in New York talking about how do we get the energy from the streets into politics. And it was Harry Belafonte and John Conyers, who was a congressman from Detroit, and Richard Hatcher, who was the mayor of Gary, and Dr. King and myself. And we stayed up till almost 1 o'clock in the morning talking about politics. And then when I said, you better get some sleep and you can sleep late tomorrow, he said, no, I'm gonna get up and get the 6 o'clock plane to Memphis, because he wanted to be with the sanitation workers in their march. And that was really the last trip before his death. So, because we'd been talking about politics, I figured that was the next stage. But I didn't want to run. I thought my role was to be an organizer and to organize campaigns for other people. But nobody wanted to run. It was Harry Belafonte who said, well, I guess you're running for Congress. I said, no, not me. He said, nobody else will run. I said, but I've never even mentioned it to my wife. He said, she's got more sense than you do. She'll know you've got to run. And so I ended up running for Congress, and that got me into politics.
What a remarkable life. And the great Andrew Young is with me in the studio. Thank you for staying with us. And just to take off from what we saw there in that video clip, around 1961, you made the decision to become an advisor to Martin Luther King. Was that by accident, by coincidence, by chance? Because you moved from New York to Alabama, then to Atlanta.
Well, you know, I say coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And we were in New York. I just bought a home, had a very good job. I had a television show. I had one of the first.
Actually, I remember you won a broadcast award.
We won a Peabody Award,
yes,
which is one of the highest awards that you can win. And we had CBS 13 weeks, a religious show trying to talk spirituality to young people. And I was enjoying it. But the Nashville sit-in story came on, and my wife, who was from rural Alabama, said, it's time for us to go home. And I said, but baby, we are home. She said, no, New York is not my home.
Right.
I said, well, what do you want me to do? She said, sell this house and quit your job. And I said, what are we going to do? She said, I don't know, but we'll do something. Now, she was pregnant with our third child. She had her master's degree thesis due in about 20, 30 days. And the baby was due in about 40 days.
Wow.
But she said, no, we've got to go now. And that's where I ended up across the hall from Martin Luther King. And his secretary, because my wife went to Alabama for her home, with her home and my children, she said, you're going to get in trouble in Atlanta if you're hanging around here single. And I said, no. She said, would you mind helping to answer some of Dr. King's mail? That's the one thing he can't keep up with his mail. He gets so much love. So I said, sure. And I was living at the YMCA in a little cramped room and nothing much to do. So she brought me a whole egg crate packed with letters. And every night I started writing answers to the people from all over the world who were writing to him. And he liked the answers. Well, we had a lot in common, as you said, both growing up in fairly privileged families and cities. We'd been to theological seminary, had studied a lot of the same writers, and we had a commitment to make the world a better place. So he liked what I was answering. And so he started asking me when he had some speeches to give that he wasn't quite prepared for. He never asked anybody to write a speech for him. He said, can you look up something on this organization and give me some ideas about what they're looking for? So I went from writing letters to research, and from there on, we just grew together.
And of course, it moved much further than that, because, I mean, you became very close to him to the extent that that landmark event in American civil rights movement, the Selma March of 1965, which eventually led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 65 and all the rest of it, you were closely involved in that with him.
Well, I was with him when we went to see President Johnson. And President Johnson was saying that he really couldn't introduce civil rights legislation. And he was burdened by the war in Vietnam. And he kept saying, I'm sorry, but the president doesn't have as much power as you think he has. And he must have said a dozen times, I'm sorry, I agree with you, I wish I could, I just don't have the power. And that was true. But when we came out of the White House and I was ready to take a vacation, a sabbatical, he'd been on the front line, he'd been stabbed, he'd been beaten, he'd been jailed, his property taken from him. And I said, you need a rest. It's 10 years from the start of Montgomery in 1955 to the beginning of 1965. But he said, no, we've got to find a way to get the president some power. Now I said, I mean, he was not a big guy. He was my size. He was just as broke as I was. We had no money. We had no army, no guns, and yet when I realized he was serious, it suddenly occurred to me that he's not thinking politically as I was. He's not thinking economically as I had to do as the executive director of the organization, that his was a spiritual calculus. And 2 days later, this lady came over to visit us, Amelia Boynton, who had been in Selma since 1929 with George Washington Carver. She actually lived to lead a Get Out the Vote march for President Obama's second term.
Wow.
She lived and was leading political marches at 105. But she was about 65 then, and She came and talked about how they were being persecuted in Selma and said, "You've got to come help us." So we decided to go to Selma on the 2nd of January, 1965. Before the end of March, Lyndon Johnson was standing in the Congress introducing Voting Rights Act and ending his speech with, "We shall overcome."
I read somewhere that he said that one of the best things that you guys did for him was Selma.
Yeah.
And I know you've probably been asked this countless times. We've got a couple of minutes before we have to take another break. But what do you remember of Martin Luther King's last day on earth?
I remember that as one of the most fun days. He was a young man. He was just 39 when he was killed.
And you were with him at that
I was
Lorraine
with him
hotel.
well, I had been in the courtroom that
Right.
day, all day long. And when I came back to his room, his younger brother was there, and he hadn't seen him in a couple of months. And all of his college friends had come down to Selma to be with him. And they'd been eating catfish and hush puppies. And so everybody was feeling good. And when I came in, he said, "Where have you been?" I said, "You haven't called me all day long." And I said, "I've been on the court trying to make it possible for you to march." He said, "But you have to keep in touch with me. Don't you remember, I'm the boss about this." And I said, "Oh, come on, shut up," you know. And he grabbed a pillow and threw the pillow at me, and I threw it back at him. Well, then everybody picked up pillows and started beating me up. But it was like we were in our 30s, but we were acting like we were 10. But I'd never seen him so completely free and happy. And at about 5:45, somebody knocked on the door and said, "You all are supposed to be at my house for dinner at 6 o'clock. And you better come and get ready." And so he went up to his room to put on a shirt and tie to go out to dinner. And that's when the bullet shot.
Extraordinary.
But he always said that death is the ultimate democracy. Everybody's got to die.
Well,
there's no escape from it.
Well, that is true. We'll talk more about this in a moment. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the former U.S. ambassador to the UN and former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Onyekolu. Now, as US Ambassador to the UN, Andrew Young would become the architect of the first US-Africa policy grounded in human rights, helping to negotiate an end to white minority rule in Namibia and Zimbabwe. His involvement with Africa has continued in the years since his term as ambassador. President Bill Clinton appointed him founding chair of the Southern African Enterprise Development Fund, and in 1996 he co-founded Good Works International, where for nearly 20 years he's promoted an approach to sustainable economic development in Africa and the Caribbean grounded in profitability and social responsibility. Well, let's not forget that Andrew Young was also instrumental in the building of modern-day Atlanta. He was elected mayor of the city in 1981 and re-elected in 1985 with nearly 85% of the vote. Atlanta International Airport, whose development he championed, made it possible for the city to attract more than 1,000 new businesses, as well as $70 billion in foreign direct investment and 1 million new jobs to the region during his tenure. It is now one of the busiest airports in the world. Mr. Young also led the successful effort to bring the 1996 Olympic Games to Atlanta. In a moment, we'll speak some more with Andrew Young. But first, here he is talking about how he became mayor of Atlanta.
When Jimmy Carter started running for president, he was really a very good guy and one of the smartest people I knew. And I ended up working with him, and then he said, I need you to go to the United Nations as ambassador. And I said, I'd rather stay in Congress. And he said, no, I need somebody who was with Martin Luther King to represent the United States in the UN. So that took care of that. We really did a lot of good things in South Africa, in Panama, and with Egypt and Israel. And when Maynard left, they didn't want another black mayor. And I didn't want to be mayor. I had one daughter in law school, one in engineering school, one just starting college, and the mayor's salary was $50,000 a year. So I didn't know how I could be mayor and support my family. But there was a nice little old lady by the name of Miss Susie Laborde from Southeast Atlanta. And she came in a meeting when we were talking about the mayor, and she shook her walking stick in my face. And she said, look here, boy, when you came here, you wasn't nothing. We made something out of you. Now that we need you to run for mayor, you ain't got time for us. We done wasted our time on you. And she turned and she walked out of the room and she slammed the door so hard she almost broke the windows. And I said, oh, Lord. I couldn't say no to her. And so I said, I don't know how we'll live or how we'll pay tuitions, but I guess I got to run for mayor. And so that's how I got to be mayor.
And the civil rights champion, former U.S. ambassador to the UN and former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young, is with me in the studio. Absolutely fascinating story. And the way that you tell it, I just loved that bit where you talk through that sort of Southern American sort of lingo there, which sort of tells it like it really is. But let's talk about your relationship with Africa in general and Nigeria in particular, because that relationship with Nigeria, you could say, is personified in your friendship over several decades with former President Olusegun Obasanjo.
Well, you know, it started back at college with, well, I went to college very young, and one of my Nigerian classmates kind of took an interest in me. He ended up being the dean of the medical school at Ibadan and one of the leading neurosurgeons, Emmanuel Latunde Odeku. And he studied all the time, and I was playing around.
As we all
and
do.
Having a good time. And but he would study, he would sleep 4 hours a night, and then he'd get up and study. And he'd take a 2-hour nap in the afternoon and study. And he graduated summa cum laude in 3 years with double majors in chemistry and physics. I still have not met anybody any smarter than him. So my respect for and admiration of Nigeria goes way back. But my family was educated by missionaries who came out of college right after the Amistad Rebellion in 1847, I think. And the reason they had an opportunity to get an education was that missionaries made a sacrifice. And so I grew up thinking I might end up going, well, actually, I actually signed up to go to Angola as a missionary. And so did my wife, and we never quite made it because the Portuguese wouldn't let us, wouldn't let any more black Americans in. And we ended up going into Georgia in a little country church. But the church and Africa have always been a part of my life. And
And
I guess
Obasanjo was just an extension of that, was he?
Obasanjo was, well, we knew about Mandela, and we knew about South Africa. I knew about Albert Lutuli, who founded the ANC, and I knew about Sheikh Anta Diop, who wrote books about the African origins of all civilization. And so I was always curious about Africa. I came to Africa after, I came to Africa to a World Bank meeting in 1974, and in June. And then in September, I came back to the Congo with the African American Institute. And then Arthur Ashe won the Atlanta tennis tournament, and they invited him to come to South Africa in December. And actually that was kind of controversial, but I thought he ought to come. And I said, it will mean a lot. South Africa is in a pre-revolutionary stage. I didn't think boycotting would help anything. I said, it'll help if you go with your tennis racket in a white man's sport, and just let them know that you can hold your own with everybody else. And he said, well, you go with me. So we went with him, and we ended up sitting in the government box with all of these Afrikaners. Well, they were just like the white folks I grew up with in Louisiana or in Georgia. And so I was comfortable. But then I came to Nigeria, to Festac, and that's when I met Obasanjo. And it was in the middle of, I was also ambassador by that time. And Jimmy Carter had asked me to go to Africa and talk to as many African leaders as possible and ask them how America could help them and what did they expect of us. Well, that's the first time I think any American president has asked anybody for advice. But we got very good advice, and we got good advice from Julius Nyerere, from Kenneth Kaunda, Samora Machel, Obasanjo, and it was when Obasanjo, I think that the Daily Times gave me a pretty hard time.
It's a Nigerian newspaper.
Nigerian newspaper, because they had not let Kissinger come to Nigeria because he had been to South Africa. Well, I'd been to South Africa too, and they let me come. And I never forget, you probably knew him, a young man by the name of Stanley McCabe.
Oh, yeah.
See,
Stanley McCabe, yes.
The headline was, send a nigger to catch a nigger. And I said,
I like that.
So,
well, I don't like that, but I mean, you know what I mean.
Well, I didn't get upset about it, right. But he wasn't any bigger than me. And I said, look, I am an ambassador, and I'm representing the United States government. And I want you to know that I appreciate your doing your job. But I'm also a nigger, as you said, and I don't want to have to kick your ass.
I like that. That's brilliant. We're going to take a break in a minute, but I mean, you became, as UN ambassador during that period, beyond the fact that you extended American diplomacy, possibly beyond what a lot of hawks and conservatives would have wanted to see. I mean, you were not just talking to
Martin
Africans.
Luther King had given his life for peace.
But you were also talking to the PLO, and that led to your resignation.
Well,
that's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which at the time was a proscribed organization.
I was talking to the PLO because Moshe Dayan,
that's the Israeli
foreign minister, had lunch with me and asked if I could help. Harry Belafonte had Shimon Peres, the Prime Minister of Israel, at his home, and I'd spent 4 hours with them talking about what could we do to help the Palestinian situation. And the relationship between the black community and the Jewish community in New York was very sensitive.
Right.
And I said I couldn't do anything in New York, that had to come from Washington. But then the Palestinians saved the report of the Committee on Palestinian Rights till I was the president of the Security Council.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm going to have to ask you to wait. We'll just have to take this break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Andrew Young. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now let's talk contemporary American politics with my guest, the civil rights champion, former congressman, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young. For many Americans, Donald Trump's incendiary tweets aimed at immigrants show him to be a racist and a white nationalist. But maybe we exaggerate the importance of Donald Trump's contribution to America's problems with race, because there are those who say the roots of racism run deep and an honest assessment has barely begun. Can the US ever fix a problem intimately bound up with its past? And of course, Election Day is still more than a year away, but the race to become the Democratic challenger to Donald Trump is already well underway. Who will emerge victorious? There's also the issue of gun control and all that talk about finding new federal regulations to limit its use. Well, with me in the studio, the former US ambassador to the UN and former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. You were just finishing before we went on a break, and we will obviously talk about American politics, but you were talking about the reasons that led to your resignation as UN ambassador.
Yeah, well, it was simply that I would have had to veto the resolution that the Palestinians were bringing. And the Palestinians were recognizing Israel. They were accepting all of the UN resolutions that we'd been trying to get them to accept. And I talk to the Palestinians all the time. I talk to everybody all the time. I talk to the Russians, played tennis with the Russians almost every other week. And we had, when the Chinese came back to the UN, we were the first ones to have the whole Chinese delegation over to our house to dinner and cook fried chicken and greens and sweet potatoes and corn on the cob and barbecue, had a good old Southern feast for them. And so it's the job of the ambassador to get along with everybody. And the UN is one of the most powerful places in the world. I think it can be more powerful than the presidency because you have the freedom to talk to 200 nations every day. And because I had a very good relationship with the president, and he encouraged me, Jimmy Carter is an amazing fellow. At 95, he's still going strong. And his analysis of where we are now is that we're in economic trouble. And the reason we're in economic trouble is that we've been spending money on wars since 1979, somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 trillion. China has not had a war since 1979.
That's a good point.
And so they have been investing in infrastructure and growing their economy by $3 trillion. So it's not a matter of communism and capitalism. It's a matter of war and peace. And wars cost and waste money and are destructive. And anytime you have violence, and in fact, it's the warring factions of young people who are angry and frustrated here in Nigeria that probably are the most dangerous to the progress and prosperity of Nigeria.
Well, you mentioned that, and that brings me to a question that I'd like to ask you, because I mean, you've represented Nigeria with your firm Good Works. You were trying to launder the image of Nigeria, especially after the...
Nigeria's image doesn't need laundering.
Well, at the time...
Even at
the time your firm was actually hired as a PR firm on behalf of Nigeria, wasn't it?
Long before that, we did... Actually, I was hired as a representative of American companies.
Right.
General Electric we sold $500 million worth of power generation facilities and had them installed
in Nigeria.
Right. And never really got paid for it.
Sure.
Not by Nigeria, but by General Electric.
But what I wanted to ask you was this. I mean, you're a good big friend of Africa. You're a friend of Nigeria.
Yeah.
There's been recently, you were talking about the swirling mass of people in this country who, if they're not taken care of, could get very angry indeed. And we've just heard recently in America.
Anger is stupidity. My daddy told me, in order for me to survive in that neighborhood, at 4 years old, my daddy used to say, don't get mad. If you lose your temper in a fight, you're going to lose your head in the fight. Use your head, but when you get angry, the blood rushes from your head and you'll do something stupid.
The problem, of course, is that in a country like Nigeria, with extraordinary levels of poverty and a sense that the government has consistently failed the people.
Now, I'm not.
And if I could just make this point, and they're going out of the country.
You're blaming it on government.
No, I'm not. What I'm actually aiming to ask you is what Nigerians are doing in America, for example. I mean, we've just heard literally a couple of days ago that 77 Nigerians were arrested by the FBI for fraud. And this Forbes under 30 millionaire was also arrested for fraud. He's Nigerian. So is that a big concern for you, having to defend Nigeria in the face of that?
Half of our cabinet has been arrested practically. I mean, these are confusing, frustrating times. And we're in the midst of a social revolution. It's what Klaus Schwab of Davos Group calls the fourth industrial revolution. And everything is up for grabs. And basically the answers are in that we do not have a comprehensive economy like the economy that John Maynard Keynes brought to the world after the Second World War, and that held the world together. And I mean, through the decolonization period. It was under Watergate that they changed that, and we went on this roller coaster economy. And America has not understood, and Europe has not understood, and everybody's doing the same thing. So don't blame Nigeria.
Well, I'm not blaming Nigerians. I'm talking specifically about a group of people who've been arrested.
But I'm talking about
and the reputation.
I'm talking about a group of people in England who left the European community. Well, they can't get along without Europe. And then the Germans are divided.
Right.
And everybody's blaming their troubles on somebody else.
Well, let me ask you this.
And all I'm saying is, it's real, but the troubles are real and they are not from anybody else.
Right.
They are our troubles, and we're going to only solve them as we come together calmly and rationally.
And who's we?
Nigerians.
Right.
Wherever, you never know where the brain power is going to come from.
And what do you think?
In Africa,
right,
it was a combination of Obasanjo and Julius Nyerere that got Nelson Mandela out of jail. And there were many, many others that took part. But in terms of the power factor, they got independence for Zimbabwe and Namibia. And those countries are doing very well. Mugabe never failed to honor every agreement he made. It was the British that didn't honor the agreements that they made.
Okay, let me ask you this. We've got literally a couple of minutes before we have to end the program. What do you think of President Trump and his style of governance? Are you surprised, shocked, appalled, appreciative? I mean, compared to the time, I mean, you talked in glowing terms of Jimmy Carter, the way he sent you off to liaise with African countries and so on. How do you compare that period to this period?
Well, there's absolutely no comparison, but one of the rules Dr. King taught us was that with all of the problems we had in race and violence and bloodshed, we did not criticize our country when we were abroad. It is my country after all. And for as many bad, crazy, stupid things that we do, we've done some wonderful things all over the world. And we'll continue to do some wonderful things. Right now, we're on a battle. We have 20 Democrats and one Trump. But still, the top 5 Democrats could beat Trump. I don't count those polls. I think Trump is a force to reckon with, because I think America is very insecure right now.
Okay.
And that insecurity expresses itself in what I would rather call ethnocentrism.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you there, but I have to bring the interview to an end. Mr. Andrew Young, thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.